If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am a survivor of Bob Jones University. And this is Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism, which is a podcast that sheds light on Christian fundamentalism in the context of Bob Jones University. The show includes survivor stories from BJU and also Bob Jones affiliated ministries like Christian day schools, camps, and churches. The podcast also explores BJU's influence beyond the school and its impact on American society. I want to thank my Patreon supporters who allow me to do this work, and if you could join my Patreon, it would be greatly appreciated. The link is in the description of every episode. But if you feel that you can't do that, then I would appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because this helps other listeners like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Andrew Pledger. And before we get into the interview, I wanted to really dig a little bit into the history of the church that will be discussed today on the podcast. And Tabitha June Frady comes forward and shares her experiences at Bethany Baptist in Brevard, which is connected to the Wilds. And of course, she shares her experience of the Wilds throughout this series. But this first episode focuses on Bethany Baptist in Brevard. I really wanted to do a quick overview of the history. So Bethany Baptist Church in Brevard was established in 1968 as an independent fundamental Baptist church, so IFB. And for those who have not listened to my episode with Eric Skwarczynski, it's called Uncovering the Independent Fundamental Baptist Movement. I recommend hearing that episode to understand the IFB. All right, and so Bethany Baptist, it started as a small group meeting in homes and eventually grew to become a recognized church. Jack Fenimore was the founding pastor. Kenneth Huggins was called to be the pastor in 1974, and in 1975, the name of the church was changed from Bethany Bible to Bethany Baptist to more accurately reflect the beliefs. And in 1977, they needed more space, so they sold the property and purchased a Church of God building on West Fritz Broad Avenue. And in the fall of 1980, they started Bethany Christian School. And then in 1987, Bill Hill became the pastor. And then in 2006, Pastor Matt Collier was called to serve. And currently, the church is pastored by Abe Stratton, and the associate pastor is Paul Witt. And it was interesting, I was looking at their website, and they didn't seem super transparent of whether they were an IFB church or not, which is interesting to me, because when people aren't transparent, something is going on there. But anyways, before we get into the interview, I wanted to share Tabitha Frady's response to the preview that was released. There was backlash from it, and I did not have her name in it because I wanted people to leave her alone as long as possible and let her have peace. But she decided to comment on a post in a Bob Jones survivor group, basically just admitting that she was the one that came forward. And I asked her if it was okay to share this comment that she posted, and she said it was okay, so I wanted to share it. And this was her response to some backlash to it. And she says, and I quote, I know that at times listening to Expose All podcasts can be scary, especially due to the heavy indoctrination of the IFB movement. I would ask that you all listen to this series with an open mind and an open heart. I am not bitter or angry at Bob Jones or the Wilds or my family or God, but what is occurring is wrong. On the contrary, I have moved on and am happy in my life. I chose to come forward and share for very specific reasons, and it was a hard, difficult decision. The things I'm sharing come from a life, not a summer, not a week, not a month, but a lifetime of direct experience. My hope is that these organizations will finally begin to, number one, recognize the need for change. Number two, apologize publicly and openly for the harm, damage, and shame they have caused. And number three, bring in experts, not people they've trained, but legitimate experts to help in the healing and rebuilding process. So that was her comment. And I really do hope you will listen with an open mind and open heart. Before we get into the episode, I want to say that this is a 4-part series, and this podcast is bi-weekly, but for this series, I'm making an exception. Thank you for listening, and this is part 1 of Exposing the Wilds. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to have Tabitha June Frady on the show today to share her experiences of growing up in Bethany Baptist in Brevard and also working at the Wilds Christian Camp. And I'm just so excited, I'm also like proud of you so much, Tabitha, for coming forward, because I remember when you messaged me late last year and was just sending me message after message, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so much. I was just like, what an incredibly strong human to survive all of this, and then so brave to come forward and being willing to speak about it. So thank you so much for coming forward. And I know we've talked a lot before this, and it's been a long time coming. But for those who aren't familiar with you, could you give a quick introduction about yourself and your upbringing?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for having me. I know this has been a really long time coming, and I'm excited to talk about my story that I'm sure many other people have been through and maybe just aren't ready to come forward. So hoping that this gives you all strength to come forward and share your stories about the very toxic environment of the wild. That's my goal of being on here. So I grew up attending Bethany Baptist Church from the time I was born until I was about 18. My parents were not initially from like a Baptist environment or an IFB background when they first met. They actually met at a bar, very normal meeting and life leading up to it. My mom had grown up Methodist and my dad had moved about 49 times before 12th grade. So he was in a very hard home environment and he was really looking for stability and community because he'd never had that. He never had friends or family. And as I'm sure many of us know that grew up in the IFB movement, they really know how to draw you in initially. And it's not until later that you realize that you're now a part of something that's really bad. So my parents met and got married, and my father, when they were talking about having children, really felt like they should be in a church. This was just like a normal thing that he was like off a checklist, basically get married, have kids, go to church with the kids. So he found Bethany in Brevard because Brevard is a very small town. So there's not a lot of church options. And they went there and met with the leaders and ended up joining the church. And what a lot of people don't know is that Bethany Baptist Church was the mother hub for the Wilds people. So all of the Wilds staff, most of them anyway, actually attended the church that I grew up in, which lended to a lot of the cultish environment that exists in the church. And then the Wilds was such a big part of that, that we grew up being very actively involved in all of the Wilds ministries. I knew all of the leaders from the camp. So if anyone listening to this ever worked there, I knew all of them personally. They knew me personally. And I was actively involved in watching their kid, helping with the nursery and the environment in the church and all of that stuff. So that's kind of situation with the Wilds and Bethany and my initial going there.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that because when I first talked to you, it was just fascinating to me how this IFB church was overtaken by the wild staff and you grew up in this. And just when we talked, just hearing about just the horrible things that happened at this church. And then I know this church also, when you were there, had a school attached to it. Do you know if the school is still there or not?
Yes, the school is still a very active
Mm-hmm.
part. I actually know the principal of the school. When I was growing up, the guy that I was closest to, like my best friend, his father and mother are now like the leaders of the school. So that's interesting. But growing up, he was not the principal, and the pastor was technically like the overarching person of the school. So he handled all that. And then there was a principal, but he was under the pastor. And then there were teachers. But when I first started in the school, we had a lot more teachers and we had a lot more students. And it was interesting to see that number start to drop as people became more enlightened in what wasn't okay. So Bethany Christian School is where I went to school from kindergarten to 8th grade. I was in that school. It was a very horrible school. And when I tell people about it, initially, I think I didn't realize like how bad it was. You always see your trauma through somebody else has it worse. But when you start to share with people some of the experiences that you grew up in, they were horrified. And I was like laughing about it. Just like, yeah, isn't that crazy? And they were like, this is insane. Why were you in this school? This was abuse, what they were doing to you. And that's when I started to realize this wasn't normal for everybody. And something that I think we've talked about is that they separate you from your parents a lot in these environments. So they really teach a lot of your pastor and God are like the highest authority. And then your parents and your teachers are also an authority and they're on the same level. So you're taught to like listen to what your teachers say and do whatever they say to do. And they're not very honest with the parents about everything that they teach. So we would have Bible class every morning and scripture memory every morning. And then Wednesdays, we all had to go to chapel together where we sat there for an hour and a half as kindergartners, listening to a message from the principal of the school. And if you fidgeted or if you moved or you weren't like giving 100% of your attention, you got in trouble afterwards. It would also quiz you on what was asked during this chapel and during this Bible class and things like that you would have to remember because they would ask you questions. And if you didn't know the answer, then you were again belittled, berated, made fun of, and then usually punished as well for not paying attention during this class. And actually the discipline was pretty interesting. They actually still encourage spanking and not in a healthy way. I personally never got sent to the principal's office, but my brother was sent many times because the kids would pick a scapegoat. They would put all the bad stuff on them. So my brother was the scapegoat of his class because unfortunately, as a Frady or what I grew up, and we all have very guilty countenances. We don't want to be in trouble. So when somebody's accusing us, we're like, yeah, we did it. Basically, just because we don't want to be in trouble. So he would get sent to the office and they would ask 3 questions. What did you do? What should you have done? And what must I now do? And you had to answer those. And then there was a wooden hand that was about an inch thick with a handle. And you would get a certain amount of swats based off of that. And they don't call the parents first. They would just do it. And then they would send you home and you would tell your parents that this had happened. And my mom actually got really angry about it and went to the school and said that she wanted to be told if they were going to discipline us. So that was like really bad. I was like 5 and I bit my nails all the time. And I remember my teacher berating me for biting my nails. And it was just an anxiety thing. But she berated me and said it was so bad and how unladylike I was for doing it. And I remember trying to open a can of those clementines for my snack time. And I couldn't get it open. I'm 5. I couldn't get it open. So I took it to her and she told me that I had to open it myself or I couldn't eat. So I tried to open it and I spilled juice everywhere and I got in trouble for making a mess. So again, it was this you can't win situation if you do or you don't. And they just get you into this mindset that you just have to do everything they say perfectly or you're going to be in trouble. So we weren't allowed to talk in line. We weren't allowed to move in line. We had to be like soldiers, like our shoulders back and like standing perfectly at our sides. You couldn't talk to your friends when the teacher was out of the room. You had to sit quietly. And if they came in and you were talking, there was like corporate punishment. So all of you would have to lay your heads down on the desk and you weren't allowed to talk or move for an hour. And this was just how they did it. Or they
Oh
would
my God.
publicly shame and humiliate you. So
Mm.
I was really bad at math, and my teacher made me stay at my desk in front of all the students and write 1 to 100 4 times because she told me I had to be better at my math
Oh
than
my
I
God.
was. And I was 5. I'm 5 years old at this point, and I remember this
Ugh.
vividly. And one of the other girls couldn't do English very well. And again, same thing, public humiliation, made her write her words on the board 100 times, like publicly mocked her in front of the class about how she couldn't pronounce things correctly or spell correctly. One time she asked me why I only wore slip-on shoes, and it was because I couldn't tie like a knot. Again, I'm 5. And she like publicly embarrassed me in front of my class and was like, "You need to learn how to tie your shoes. This is unacceptable. Like, you have to go home and you have to learn how to do this." So it was things like
Mm.
that. I remember after the clementine incident, I never packed a can of clementines again. And my mom asked me, and I like broke down in tears and was like
Mm.
crying. And I was like, I can't open it and not make a mess, and I get in trouble every time that I do. She started packing me different lunches. My brother went so far as to only pack 2 grapes for his snack because if you didn't finish your snack, she would make you sit at the table until you did finish your snack. So you weren't allowed to go to recess. You weren't allowed to go back to class until you ate all of your food that was packed. And again, public humiliation, did this in front of all the students, berated you, made you feel so small. It was wild. 5 years old. This is the
Oh.
punishment that we were going through. And then at our kindergarten graduation, we had to stand up in front of the entire church and recite 100 passages of scripture, not verses. So not like John 3:16. I'm talking like entire psalms, several different chapters, things like that. And we had to recite them in front of the entire school. And then we had to perform like math drills and spelling drills. And the rehearsal leading up to that was so terrifying. All the girls were like crying because you're getting ready to stand in front of this whole group of people. And she basically threatened us and said that if we didn't do well, that we would regret it. She wouldn't pass us right there in front of the entire church. Like we wouldn't be allowed
Mm.
to graduate kindergarten. Wild.
Oh my gosh.
And I remember like with her when we were 5, I think it was Thursday, she would make us go upstairs to the auditorium because the church was on the top level and the school was on the bottom level. So we're like in the basement of the church. So this is where the school is. So we would have to go up to the auditorium and clean the auditorium as 5-year-olds. We would have to go through and gather all the things and throw it away, the bulletins and
Oh.
all of that stuff. So My family, I don't know how everyone else's church was, but you always sat in the same place. Nobody like sat in different rows. You always sat in the same row. And we always sat behind the Lynns and then the Cowards. I remember this specifically, like it was the Lynns, the Cowards, and then us. So we sat in this one row and they all knew that we sat in this one row. So we came to that row to clean, and I had some coloring pages there from the sermons because my mom would let us color during the sermon because it's hard to sit through an hour and a half long sermon as a 5-year-old. And my teacher found them and she was like, "Whose are these?" And she looked right at me. She already knew whose they were. And I said, "They're mine." And she, in front of my class, berated me and said I was childish for coloring and how I was displeasing to God for not listening during the sermon on lasciviousness, that I had no idea what that was. I was so embarrassed that she would catch me again. I never colored in church again. Like my mom would hand out coloring sheets and I would like purposefully
Mm.
not take one because I was terrified that she would find it again and call me out in front of my class. So that's just kindergarten. That's not even the rest of the school years, but
I'm so sorry. It's horrible to hear just the abuse from such a young age of being broken down into this obedient little soldier that's compliant no matter what. And this is so sadly common in these different IFB church cults. Honestly, just your individuality doesn't matter. Obedience is prioritized above all else, and that authority figure, their power is prioritized above all else. And like I think, in previous episodes we've talked about this before, but these kinds of environments attract these kinds of people that give you unchecked power and they enjoy it. And I remember you telling me another story we had talked of this teacher grabbing y'all by the face. And I don't know if you wanted to share that story or not.
yeah, absolutely. So one of the punishments that you got in the class was being sent to the hall. So there were like levels of punishment. So all of us had a thing on the wall, like a monkey, for instance, with 3 bananas. And if you did something bad, they would take a banana from your board in front of the whole class. They would do this. So you would lose a banana. And if you lost 2 bananas, then you got sent to the hall, and they replace them every week. So you only had 3 chances a week to mess up. If you lost your 3rd banana, you were sent to the principal's office and spanked. So these are the levels that you would go through. So if you got a 2nd banana taken, you would be sent to the hall, and you would have to walk out in front of the whole class to the hallway. And then the teacher would follow you out after a few minutes. She would make you stand there by yourself in the hall where all the other students are walking, all of the teachers are walking. It's again this public humiliation thing. And you're just standing there as a kid, terrified, wondering what's going to happen. And she would come out and she would grab our faces, like in our cheeks, and lift our heads up so we were eye to eye with her, so close to her face that you could smell her breath, you could see like her
Mm.
mascara, like you're so close.
Oh my
And she
God.
would then threaten you or tell you that you needed to do something different, how you had messed up. And like she would leave fingernail marks in our faces. She made my brother bleed one time. My mom saw that and she was like furious.
Mm.
But again, they never took us out of the school and the church. So that's interesting. But yeah, would hold our faces until we bled and then make us go back into class. Again, public humiliation. So that was the standard. That was the 2nd level of punishment. And then if you went back into class and you lost a 3rd banana, then you were sent to the principal's office where you were asked those 3 questions and then spanked. And you could hear it. The whole school, all the walls were so thin, you could hear when
Oh.
kids were getting spanked and like them
Mm.
screaming. And it was so horrible. You're
Oh.
just sitting there. And again, they would take you out of class and then bring you back into class immediately following the spanking. So they're crying. And again, this public humiliation, like everyone knows that you just got spanked. and you're just sitting there and it's just mortifying. So the emotional mental trauma from that is so real for so many of the students. Just
Oh
being
my
afraid
God.
to speak out or say anything because you're going to be punished. I remember my brother's friend tried to speak up for him one time when all these students were like, yeah, Philip was the one that did that. It wasn't. It was this pastor's son from another church that did this. And they blamed Philip. And of course, Philip looks guilty because he has our face. And they took him to be spanked. And my brother's friend was like, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. And they looked at him and told him to shut up and sit down and not to question his elders. So wild. You couldn't even
Oh
stand up for somebody.
my gosh. Like just the terror you feel, and you're just put in this state of hyper vigilance. And I can see like something, and as I've learned too from my own experiences, is these fundamentalist environments, they set you up to be this person that strives for constant perfection, and you never feel like you're enough. You feel so worthless, and you're just broken down from such a young age and turned into this submissive, robotic kind of individual that is like deep down inside so afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. Because one of the things too about authoritarian environments is there are rules, but they're laid out, but there
Right.
are also unspoken rules that you break them and you find out that they're a rule, and then you're punished for it. And a big reason for that is, like I said earlier, there are individuals in these environments who have these authoritarian personalities who enjoy belittling people, berating, hurting, and they get sadistic, I think, pleasure, honestly, from that. They love having that power and control.
Mhm.
And it's just so cruel
Yeah.
to abuse that power and just the trauma that it just passes on. And then they're doing it in the name of religion, which I think has it adds a whole other layer of this is what God wants us to do,
Mhm.
and really just hurts that view of God, religion, that ability to connect with that. But oh, I'm so sorry
No,
you went through.
I think one of the songs that they made us like learn, and it's still, isn't it crazy that you can still remember like songs from when you were 5? But one of the songs that they made us sing in class was OBEY, obey always, OBEY, obey now. And then it kept going, obey father, obey mother, obey teacher, to obey God, and all of this stuff. And there was like a whole verse on that. And then you would be like, OBEY, obey always. And so again, it's this like idea that you can't question authority or ask any kind of question whatsoever. You're just supposed to listen to what they say and just do it, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're just supposed to do it. And the one of the most like crazy answers I think was when you would ask a question and they'd say, because I said so. There was no why or explanation. And they
Yeah.
were like, because I said so, you have to do it because I'm older than you. So you have to do this. One of the teachers in the school I knew outside of the school initially, and she was really nice. And we called her Tiffany, like her name. And the kindergarten teacher that was so horrible, she insisted when she heard me say that, she like grabbed my face with her nails and was like, how dare you call her by her first name? She's your elder and you have to use correct language. And it's Miss Powell. That's what you say, Miss Powell, not Tiffany. And I was so mortified because, again, unspoken rules that you don't even know exist until you've broken them, like you were saying. So it is wild just how conditioned you were from like the time you were born to just doing exactly what they said. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm curious about the curriculum. They used the Bob Jones
Yes.
press, didn't they?
Yes, they
Ooh.
did. They used Bob Jones Press for all of the curriculum except when I did vocabulary in sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. That was a Becca. But everything else was Bob Jones Press. So they would send you to Bob Jones actually at the beginning of the school year to get all of your books from the press because
Mm.
Greenville was only an hour and a half away. And again, we had a really strong tie with Bob Jones and the Wilds. So we would go there and we would get a discount on our books because of being part of the school. So you would get all your books and you had to buy them, which is wild. And the tuition, even though it's probably very reasonable compared to most private schools, it was still a lot of money for my parents to dish out.
Mm.
And they would
Yeah.
give you discounts based on how many kids you had. So if you had 2 or 3 kids in the school, you actually paid less money than if you just had one. So they were really trying to encourage parents to enroll all of their kids in the school. But most of the outreach in the community was really poor. And the community to this day has some pretty poor opinions and feels like they were a cult. I remember hearing it all the time when I was growing up. They were like, "Oh, you're part of that cult?" So there was a lot of negative feedback for it, but they tried to insert themselves into local government to get
Oh.
more people involved. So they
Mm.
actually were successful at that for a little bit. But most of the kids that were just part of the community knew somebody in the church, and that's how they ended up in the school. So they would, like, somebody in the church would talk to them and be like, "Oh, our church has a school and it's got great education." And they would end up in there, but they'd only last a year or two. I don't even remember some of the kids in my classes because they were only there for a year and then they would be gone again. Brand new set of students the next year, and then they would leave.
Mm.
A new set of students the next year, and then they would leave. So, yeah.
It's interesting because you think they would change things to try to keep students. But in these kind of authoritarian environments, they want a very specific kind of person. And if it's not for you, or you're not going to be that moldable little soldier or submissive person, they don't want you there. That's what it was like at Bob Jones University. That's what it's like in all cults. Like
Mhm.
they want a very specific kind of person. If you're not it, then you're out.
Yeah. In middle school, they did end up removing Mrs. Sturwold from teaching. So they ended up making her the church secretary. So she was still like a part of the church, but they removed her from teaching. And then shortly after that, I would say like maybe 5 years after that, they actually removed Mr. Sturwold too. So they ended up firing him or letting him go. Like they never fired anybody. They would just,
Oh, move them around. It's so
yeah,
typical in these environments. Yeah.
right. But they were like, we feel like you've outgrown this role, and gave him like a goodbye package, but said they wanted newer blood or something like that. So he ended up like having nowhere to go and ended up working in a factory after that. He didn't have another teaching position because, again, all of this environment, your experience is limited to ministry. So no normal school is going to hire you. So he couldn't get a job teaching again, which was crazy. So he ended up, to this day, he works in a factory, from my understanding.
Mm, yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all that because I know it's so difficult. And I think that's another thing too is that makes it difficult in cults is that even the adult members feel like they can't speak up against what's happening because of that hierarchy, that pastor at the top, and all these leaders. And I think another really sad thing or a sad thing in these environments, which I noticed growing up, was because adults are in that position of authority, it is assumed they can never do wrong. And especially if they identify as a Christian. And I remember growing up, like there was this awful play director and she was horrible. Long story short, she would humiliate and berate kids, including me, in front of entire kids. And I would just talk to my parents about it and cry, and they didn't care and they didn't believe me. They're like, "No, you're overacting. You need to obey. I don't know. I can't remember exactly what they said, but it was something like, she's your authority." Oh, no, she's really not that bad. And then they did not believe me. And also my little brother, they did not believe us until another parent watched the practice and said they wanted to punch the lady in the nose because she was so mean.
Mm.
And then they were like, "Oh, fine. We won't make you do that anymore."
Yeah.
Okay.
And to that
Yeah.
point, though, that is like standard procedure in all of these environments. It
Yeah.
starts with the public humiliation to where they've just ground you down to you're just now their little soldier. Basically, you just do whatever you're told to do. It's very typical of basic training in army camps and things like that. The name
Yes.
calling, the making you feel like you're worthless, that your whole identity is wrapped up in this overarching figurehead. So it's all classic military techniques that make good soldiers, but these are children. So there's that. And then on the parent side, they are being told that this is a community and we all have to work together to raise and rear this child. So if you're coming against the teachers, now you're teaching your kids to disrespect authority, and they aren't going to be able to be this obedient soldier, basically. So to your parents, not their credit, because obviously that was horrible of them to do, but they're getting all that information because my parents were too. They were being told, like, this is all of us, and we need you to support us so that we can rear your children in school. Because if you're not supporting us, then your kids are not going to listen, and that's going to mess with the status quo. So there's all of this talk amongst the adults as well as the kids. So the way that they're teaching and the parents are ignorant of, because they're telling them, listen, the kids are just struggling to adapt to this and are struggling with having this meek and quiet spirit and being obedient. And so the parents are thinking that you're just struggling with being obedient. In the real case, it's actually abuse that's occurring. So it's really
Mm.
interesting how they
Yeah.
both sides of the system to break down the trust between parents and children, because
Mm-hmm.
they're like, we have your best interest in heart and we're trying to help you be better parents and things like that. So it's really
Mm.
interesting how they break down this like line in between you guys so that there's no more trust in between you. And so you don't tell them anything because it doesn't do any good. And then they'll
Mm.
take it back to the teachers and the teachers will retaliate against you. So that's this like circle. So if you tell your parents that something happened in school, and this did happen to me multiple times where I would go home and tell my mom like about the hallway and like the face or like the snack thing, right? And she really had to dig things out of me because she would then go talk to the teacher and be like, this isn't okay and you can't do this. And the teacher would be like, did you tell your mom that I told you that? Like, why would you do that? You need to listen to what I have to say. That was very disrespectful of you to go behind my back and dishonest. And they would say things like that. So where now I feel like I can't tell my mom because my mom's going to talk to the teacher and the teacher's going to take it out on me. Yeah, I understand.
Oh, yeah. Like it's just really like this specific method to control and not be held accountable for anything. And it is so devastating to have that, to really to suffer in silence, to break that trust between your own parents and not being able to truly voice what is going on. Oh gosh.
I remember when like the principal would come, he would do rounds of the classrooms and the pastor would do rounds of the classrooms. And I remember them telling us before they came that we needed to be perfect. Basically, while they were in the classroom, we couldn't talk, we couldn't ask questions. If they asked us questions, we were supposed to say that everything was great. And they gave us this whole spiel that we had to do. And if you didn't do that, then again, retaliation and things like that would occur. So I am so sorry that you had to go through that with the play because, again, the barrier of trust is broken
Yeah.
between parents and children to where you just don't feel safe to share anymore. And then it's only when other people speak up that you're like, oh, my kid was telling me the truth the whole time. There is abuse occurring.
Yeah, I want to bring it back a little bit to what you were saying about like the army military tactics. Really, like the military, the army, they use cult tactics to break people down, honestly. And there's an incredible cult scholar and author who wrote a book called Uncultured, and she was on the Surviving BJU podcast, Daniela Mestenek Young, and she was in the Children of God cults, but she talks about the military as a cult, is a cult in our society that we've just accepted and have completely normalized. And she was in the Children of God and then in the military, and she calls it out in her book. But something that I wanted to read, which I thought of as you were talking about, this is from Stephen Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, and he's a cult expert. Life in a destructive cult is, for the most part, a life of sacrifice, pain, and fear. It's about mind control and manipulation. The essence of mind control is that it encourages dependence, conformity, and discourages autonomy and individuality.
Yeah.
And that is just exactly just what I see through this school, through this church. And I know you have even more to share just about the church itself, which I don't know if you're ready to get into that now.
Oh, yeah, no, we can definitely move on. I think I've covered a lot of what occurred in the school and just the like tactics and things like that. We can always circle back if something is relevant, but absolutely, like we can move into the church. So the church itself was founded in 1968 and it identified as an independent fundamentalist Baptist church. So again, this is that IFB movement. It was in this very small building that has remained empty a lot in the town. So that's interesting. Personally, I think it's cursed because of all the horrible things that occurred in it. But we went there and there was no air conditioning in the church. So I remember that as kids, they would take all of the kids, again, this separation between parents and children, and they would leave the parents in the auditorium and they take all the kids upstairs to this attic. I was 4. I remember like all the older kids would come get the younger kids and take you upstairs. And the floor was like this blue carpet. And it was so hot. I remember just being so hot to the point that I started to wear lighter clothing, even in the winter, because it was so hot in this building. And we had 20, 30 kids of all ages just packed into this room. And they would have a felt board that they would do these Bible stories on the entire time the preaching is occurring. So there wasn't any breaks. They would hand out a snack while they're teaching, usually like Cheerios, something like that. Something interesting is that all of the figures on the board were white, which, as we know, Middle Eastern culture is not, they don't
Yeah.
look like us. They don't look like white with blonde hair. And that was how they depicted Jesus. That's how they depicted Paul and Peter. And there were no characters that even the wise men from Persia were white. And so it's just interesting that there was already some of this racial discrimination that was occurring, and there was not a single African American in the church or an Asian person in the church. There were none of that because there was a lot of racial discrimination.
Hmm.
So it was really interesting. That was how that initially started. And I remember that the teachers would let you come up to the board and take a piece off. That was like your reward for sitting still. And that was like such a big deal to be called out in front of all of these kids to come up and pick a piece off of the board when it was time to clean up, which is really interesting. And again, like this whole like we weren't allowed to be kids, like we were being adults. We had to clean up everything. We had to
Yeah.
put everything back the way it was. We had to listen perfectly without talking or moving or fidgeting. You had to sit just perfectly still and listen to this Bible story. And you couldn't be loud because we were right over the auditorium. And the pastor would actually send people up to tell us to be quiet if we got too loud. So that was like a big thing that would happen. Again, this public humiliation. So that was the first church. And then they had been raising money to build their own church. And they ended up doing that. And that's where the school was and all of that. So they ended up like building this church and then building it directly in mind to have a school in the basement. And I know this is back to the school really quickly, but it was interesting that we had so little supervision in middle school. right when all those hormones are starting to pop up and stuff, like we were allowed to go into the forest alone around the church and build forts and stuff. And I remember specifically like the employees in my class building a fort under a tree right down by the road. So there was the road, here's the tree. They were building a fort under the tree and like staying in it, which kind of honestly is probably a big liability issue.
Yes.
Not even to mention, like, someone could drive up on the road and easily take one of us, and there would have been no investigation into it or anything like that. And we were allowed to go all the way up in the forest and all the way through the forest. I remember running into some unsavory characters a few times in the forest and us, like, backpedaling and going back to the school during our free time. So this was, again, really interesting that, like, it was so controlling, but then at the same time, the things that you really should be a little controlling on, they just didn't seem to even register. So that was really interesting. But that was that. So the church was in this, like on this hill that used to be a dump. They bought the property and it had been a dump. So they had to remove all of the garbage and then they started to build on it. And I remember my dad like helping with the flooring because my dad was a tile contractor. And again, everyone's giving for free to do all of this. You're not getting paid to do any of this. This is just your ministry to the church. So they did a lot of the building for free. They paid for the materials, but then they would use the labor in the church to actually build the church and stuff and not pay anyone to do it, which was very interesting. So, and I remember that actually became an issue later with my dad. He was like, I can't just do work for free. Like, I have to feed a family. And they had a big issue with that. So, we finally got into the church probably when I was about 7, 2, 3 years after I remember the initial church, we moved into the new church. The pastor at the time was Bill Hill, who now runs a missionary group called ENW, which is called Equipping Nationals Worldwide. So he basically goes to other countries and teaches people how to be pastors. That's what his ministry is. He was the pastor for a long time, and he was like one of those pastors that yelled a lot during his sermons. I remember you could always tell the halfway mark because he would take his jacket off and roll his sleeves up because he would get hot about halfway through the sermon. And that's when you knew he was about halfway done with his sermon. So as a kid, I remember watching that to know when he was almost done because I didn't understand a word he was saying. He would teach from like Leviticus, and that's just hard to get through anyways, but that was his like main topics, was this very strange doctrine. When he decided to leave the church, a lot of the Wilds people were very heavily like involved in the leadership, which I will get to, but
Mm-hmm.
when he decided to leave the church, all of a sudden all these people came forward and had an issue with his teaching, which was very interesting. They never said anything while he was actually a pastor, but then when he decided to leave and we were thinking about taking him on as a missionary, all these people were very against it. And there was this like split that kind of occurred during that time where people were for it or against it. And I remember as a kid just being so terrified because it got so aggressive. These grown men are like standing and screaming at each other in the church, like saying these different things. And it was just really hard to like, as a kid, listen to. So Bethany, though, it was same environment. Like you couldn't move. You had to sit very still. They monitored your attendance. They would count the people that were there. And they would also watch to see if the set families were there. And I remember they started the photo church directory. So they would actually take pictures of you and put them in this directory. And everyone had access to it, which is wild. Your addresses, your phone numbers, your names, your kids' names, all of that was on this like book, pictures of you. So that's scary in my mind that anyone that walked into the
Yeah.
church and got a directory had access to all of our personal information. And what's to stop me from believing them when they come up and they're like, "Oh, I'm a friend of your mom, Joyce." So that was crazy to me that they like did that, but they had that. Everyone was required to attend a photography session where they took a picture of you. And then the church leadership was comprised of mostly Wilds people. So Ken Collier, who was the president of the Wilds, I think he's still maybe the president of the Wilds. He was last time I checked. He took over for Ken Hay, who was the founder, who passed away a few years ago. So he took over for him, and he was the president of the Wilds, and he was also the director of the Deacons for most of my growing up years. So he was actively involved. And then most of the leadership, like the Deacons were voted on, but the voting was based off nominations. And because 80% of our church was Wilds people, most of the time it was the Wilds people that were selected as the deacons. And then the deacons were assigned families that they had to check up on. So they would come to your house if you hadn't attended in a few weeks to see what was going on. They would call. You had to go to their, like, they would host meetings and you had to attend these meetings once a month to be a part of this. I can't remember what they called it. It was like a family time. And like you would go and you were part of this deacon's group. And that was the people that you interacted with the most. So that was interesting. Almost like house churches, but like smaller scale. And there was a big divide between the Wilds people and the town people. And this was a really big issue in the church that was brought up many times by different people of the Wilds kids versus the town kids. And I think it was because the Wilds, for those of the people that don't know, is basically a compound. All of the families live on site and they're neighbors. So all the kids grow up together. They eat at the dining hall together. So they're all eating together. They're all together all the time. And that was their friend group. So when they come to the church, they would still stay in their group and they all know each other. And the town kids are now outcasts because we weren't part of this holier group of people because they are in full-time ministry. And I was a contractor's daughter. So I was less than them. And it was interesting that they all looked alike too. They were all tall. They all were blonde. They all had the same figure, very athletic figures. So they all looked exactly the same. And then there's like me, who was redhead with very short, with a curvier figure. And so I didn't fit the mold of what they wanted. And I was also very outspoken. And they were not. They were this perfect, meek, and quiet spirit. So there was a lot of bullying that occurred. And even from a young age, I remember being bullied by these kids. They would just make up lies about like my family, or they would only sit together and I wasn't allowed to sit with them. Like I'd go to sit down and they'd be like, you can't sit here. You have to sit over there with the town kids. So I would sit on like the other side with the town kids, which is again why my best friend was like 3 years older than me, because all the kids my age were Wilds kids and I wasn't allowed to be friends with them. So it was interesting as a kid trying to navigate those dynamics of you're part, but you're not. And they tell you that this is your community and these are your friends and these are the people that you should be involved with. But I was an outsider with these people that I'm supposed to be involved with. And they tell you that if you become friends with people outside of the church, that's always going to end really badly and that you're going to somehow take on some of their characteristics. And that's not good. You should be around people that are part of the church and part of this environment. So again, a lot of isolation, even as a kid, of being bullied and like just being alone a lot of the time because I was an outsider in comparison to all of these perfect Wilds kids. And they would compare you publicly to each other. So they would say, oh, well, see how Alyssa is like standing here singing perfectly and you have a loud melody voice, so you can only be melody. So that was the main difference, is that they had all this education on music and stuff. So when you would sing in choir, this isn't the main difference, but this is something that's poignant in my mind, is that I really wanted to sing one of the harmonies because that's where all the Wilds kids sang. They all sang harmony and all the town kids sang melody because we didn't have this training. And I remember like begging the music teacher, who was a wilds person, to let me sing harmony. And she told me that I needed to be on melody because my voice was too strong to be on harmony. So again, this comparison to other people is
Yeah.
so strong. And they would let them like do all this stuff and push them in the front of the church basically. And they would stand up in front of the church and sing and do all this. And you're just back here doing nothing because you're a town kid and these are the wilds kids. And I remember doing a play and only like the wilds kids got the main parts of the play. Everyone else was like a supporting role. And it was because we were the town kids and it was easier for them to rehearse with all the wilds kids because they live in the same place. Intentional or not, they created this huge division between us to where if you weren't a wilds kid, you weren't cool. And anyone who wasn't a wilds kid wasn't cool. So I was in this outcast group of people.
Wow, I'm so sorry because the feeling of just being out of place, being left out, and that feeling of just isolation and shame and wondering, oh, what's wrong with me? And just all those feelings of, again, not being enough, not measuring up to the standard. And it's there's nothing you could have really done. That's just favoritism, sadly. But I'm curious, can you list all of the leaders in the church that are also at the Wilds? So could you list what they did at church and then what they did at the Wilds?
Sure. Ken Collier, like I said, was the president of the Wilds. He was like head of the deacons. And anytime there was a transition in church leadership, he was the main guy that handled everything. His son, Matt Collier, was my pastor for almost my entire life. And he ended up stepping down after I left the church to spend more time with his family, but he ended up becoming the director of the Wilds. That was his next role. So he also runs a ministry called Camps Abroad, which takes the wilds global. And that's a big problem for me. There's so many things. That's later down. We'll get to it. He was in charge of Camps Abroad, became the head pastor at my church, and then ended up stepping down to become the director of the wilds and run Camps Abroad still. So he was the main guy for a long time. That was Ken Collier's son. And then my youth leaders were Andrew Stoner. He had some massive title that basically meant that he was a facilities operational person in the wilds, but he was the team director. They actually removed the previous team director to make Andrew the head and Dan and Amy Brooks the head of the youth group initially. So they removed my uncle. Actually, one of my uncles was leading the group of teenagers and they wanted a wilds person. So they removed him from the role and put these wilds people in place instead. And then Dan and Amy Brooks actually started being the co-partners of Camps Abroad. So they were part of that, the wilds too. And Dan Brooks he did something at the wilds leading up to that. I think it was, again, some sort of operational role. They have all these fancy titles that basically means your operations. And then my middle school Sunday school teacher was Rick Jensen, who was in charge of the maintenance at the wilds. He did a lot of the fixing there. He was like an outsider within the circle, I feel like, because he was divorced. So that was a taboo thing there that they didn't talk about a lot, but he wasn't exactly in, but he wasn't out either. They couldn't have run a lot of the operational things there without him. So I think that's part of the reason he stayed. And then my second Sunday school teacher was Hannah Ertl, who was the daughter of Bill and Bonnie Ertl, who Bill, again, was like some sort of operational, he was like a fireman, like certified. So he handled a lot of safety stuff at the wilds. And Bonnie was in charge of getting all of the food for the wilds. So like she would get all the food. So their daughter was my next down Sunday school teacher. And then Bonnie Ertl was my teacher before her. So again, all wilds people coming down this ladder here. In charge of the college and career group was Willie Parton, who he was in charge of teen camp. He was the teen camp director. So he actually was like pretty massive there. They had more help for the college and career group. There was Matt and Heather Tracy. He was a cook at the Wilds, like the head cook for a while. A lot of things changed under him, and I'll bring him up as we're going through this because he did some pretty crazy things. Well, we'll get to it. Him and several other people of this church ended up moving when they left the Wilds. They went to Colonial Baptist Church in Indianapolis, which I don't know if you've heard of, but that's where the pastor in New England that was accused of covering up the molestation of this girl, he covered it up. He moved to that church, and then he and his son were there, and then his son was killed in a bus accident, and he's the head pastor there still. So they left the Wilds and actually got in a bus
Mm.
accident right before the church. So a lot of the people that were in my church moved to that church when they left the Wilds. So that's interesting. And then Jonathan and Jessica Mayer were part of the teen group. They were probably the most normal people, the most likely to include the town kids, I would say, in things, and most involved in community, as opposed to everyone else was very like Wilds. It's the Wilds. It's the Wilds. And then before Bonnie Erdel, I'm trying to think who taught that class. I think it was this woman named Meredith, but I don't remember much about her. I was really young in my first class, and I don't remember a ton about her like leadership in there, but she was a part of the Wilds, but I think she was like one of the single women that was a part of there, so she was disposable. So they got rid of her pretty quickly, I think, from my understanding. And then of course we played church league basketball. So when we did that, we would play against other leagues in this rec center, and our coaches were Wilds people. It was Renee Stadola. Her husband, Steve Stadola, runs the Wilds of New England now with Rand Hummel, who I grew up with for a very long time. Rand Hummel was a big player in the church. He was, again, like one of the elder type situations. So he was like up there with Ken Collier. So it was like Ken Collier and Rand Hummel. And then like this drop down. But as you can see, all of my teachers from the Wilds, all of my like authority figures from the Wilds. It was never like town people. And the deacons were always Wilds people too. So there was a lot of that. Matt Herbster was the director of the Wilds. I knew him really well because he taught my sister's soccer team in the community. So this is how they would get into the community and get kids into the school and camp and stuff, was they would do rec league sports, and they would be coaches and things like that. So Matt Herbster was a coach for a really long time. And then when I was like probably 9 or 10, Tim Meals took over the children's program somewhere between 10 and 15. I don't remember how old I was. He was the director of the junior boot camp, and my mom taught the 3 to 5-year-olds, and she was very into like free expression. She had control, but she let them have their personalities, and a lot of the Wilds parents didn't like that because they wanted their kids to be perfect and this like perfect example in church, and she would let them be kids. So he ended up having her removed from teaching the 3 to 5-year-old class, even though she had taught it for almost like 8 years. Every Sunday she was there, because he felt like she needed to teach a different way. Pastor Matt Collier and Kelly Collier, who is actively involved in the women's ministry and has written books, and Marty Collier's written a couple books too, but they adopted a son from Thailand and brought him back. And then he was not perfect. He was just a kid, and he was not perfect. And they really had an issue with that. They wouldn't let him leave their like hands in the church. Like he had to hold their hand the whole time. And my mom let him be a kid, and that was a big no for them. They wanted him to be perfect because he was the pastor's son or whatever. So that's part of the reason my mom got removed from the children's group. And then we were in Sunday school a lot, and my mom would have all of us like help her, all of us kids, and they didn't want my brother involved with the kids, even with my mom and me there. So they ended up making a law that no men could be in the nursery. So that kind of happened. I don't really know why. I think something happened, but I'm not really sure like why, but they made this like rule that only women could be in nursery, which caused this huge problem with us not having nursery some Sundays. because there wasn't enough women like volunteering to do nursery all the time. So that was crazy. But that was like some of the church like hierarchies and the like breakdown of who was in charge of everything. But it was always wild people, as you can tell from my like breakdown.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that so coherently. And I just wanted people listening just to know the extent of control that the Wild staff had over this church.
Mhm.
So I know there are some other things that happened at your church. I know there was a scandal and then some issues with your parents being kicked out. If you wanted to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, Steve Lopez and Faye Lopez is probably known more, his wife, who wrote a bunch of hymns and things like that. She was they were the music directors of the church for a while. And Mac and Beth Lynch were also part of the music leaders for the church. And Mac and Beth Lynch are responsible for writing most of the music that the Wilds has written. So they were in charge of a lot of that. So Steve Lopez was the choir director, and one of our missionaries to the Philippines had adopted several daughters. This was the Cadavos family. And their one daughter came back to the church and became like a secretary for Steve Lopez. One thing led to another. Then they ended up having a sexual relationship. I'm not sure how consensual that was because I was very young. Obviously, I didn't know whether to ask, did you say yes to this? I don't know how consensual it was, but it was discovered by another member of the church walked in on them and they reported it. And he was brought before the entire church, had to stand like on the platform and confess what he did while his wife was in the front row. And I remember that they started this and then they stopped and they were like, we're going to remove all of the children from this telling of this story. So then all the children were asked to leave. But I remember my parents talking about it afterwards. But he had sex with her and then she left. She like mysteriously disappeared from the church. I'm not really sure what happened to her, which is really sad, but I don't really know what happened to her. But he was put on church discipline, which, for anyone who's not familiar, means that the church basically blackballs you. You can't go to another church and become a member because you're blacklisted from all of the churches that are involved in the same ISB movement. So you can't go to another church. And that was huge because it was like brought before the whole church. The church voted against him. I remember him like crying on stage. I remember thinking that his kids and his wife were sitting in the front row watching this, which is just so humiliating for them. And obviously, like, this is a terrible situation. It should have never happened. Because, I think like cheating in general is terrible, like to do to your family. And it was very devastating for them. I do believe they ended up getting divorced because he went and had another affair and they ended up getting divorced. And she was still like writing music and stuff, but they like disappeared. And only she has really been like heard from still for her like piano arrangements. So I'm not really sure what happened to him following that, but
Yeah.
he was blacklisted from all other churches, never allowed to be in an area of ministry again, had to like just start over, which is pretty
Hmm.
crazy because
Yeah.
even though what he did was not right, I don't know, like what he did was not right, but they never reported it. She suddenly disappeared. I don't know if it was consensual, but this would be very indicative of a non consensual relationship or at least a very pressured relationship because she was so much younger than him and she just disappeared. Nobody ever followed up with her or checked in.
Mm.
She was made out to be like this horrible scarlet letter type situation of she must have enticed him and seduced him. And it was this whole big scandal and everyone was very against her and against him. And it was almost complete, trying to think of the word complete, like they were just completely kicked out and like never associated with again.
Mm.
So that was pretty crazy. And then I did want to talk a little bit just about the teachings that were really brought up when I was in the like youth group. specifically. So I remember that modesty was really pushed. And I remember even at 8 years old shopping at Hamrick's, which is like for people who are 98, there it's like suits and with the padded shoulders and
Yes.
everything super long because they were like, you have to be modest, so nothing from here to the bottom of your knee should be showing.
Yes, I remember my mom would take me to Hamrick's with her when I from a young age. I completely forgot that, but that brought that memory back up. But
Yeah.
yes, I forgot that existed.
I was 8 and I'm shopping at this like ridiculous store. And I remember one time my dad was not fully on board with what the church was teaching. And he tried to get me to buy a pair of jeans. And I was like weeping because I was terrified to wear this because I wouldn't be modest and God would have something against me because I wasn't being modest. And he was like, well, you don't have to wear it if you don't want to. But I was like weeping openly because I was afraid to not be modest because they push that so hard. Like you have to be modest all the time. And I look at like my style and it's embarrassing. I've deleted like most of those pictures because I looked like an old woman in a child's body, which is so sad. And then in the youth group, you weren't like really allowed to have like friends of the opposite gender. And if you did, everyone just assumed that you guys were going to get married, which is crazy. I was like 12 and they were like, Kristen, you are going to get married one day. And I was like, absolutely not. Like, that is not happening. But that's the interactions, is that you couldn't be friends with a guy without them assuming that you guys were going to get married or have some kind of relationship like that. I remember that when I came into the youth group, I'd been bullied so much leading up to my teen years by the church that I was so afraid of everything and I wanted to just be perfect and I really wanted to be this perfect person. And I remember that one of the girls like came into the church and she's actually still like one of my best friends. And she came in from a really horrible home situation, changed like everything. And she was very questioning of the teachings that were occurring. And they would shut her down. Like she would say something and they would be like, don't ask questions. You don't need to ask questions, just do this. Andrew Stoner was really bad about being like, don't ask questions, just do this. And her grandma was raising her. And at one point, she went to Florida and wore a bikini and posted it on her page, on her Facebook page. And they had 3 different women from the church go talk to her about taking that picture down because they said it was causing the boys in our youth group to lust after her, which is so crazy to say to somebody. And then when she left the church and went to Florida for college, so Andrew Stoner went with his wife to her grandma's house and said that she should give her up to someone in the church as a family because they felt like she should have a man's presence in her life.
Oh no.
Yeah, so and her grandpa had just died like a few years before. So they said that she should give her up, and her grandma ended up calling her and crying and saying that it was so wrong of them to do this. So that was like some of the things that would occur in that was, and again, this is like this thing of if you dress improperly, you're causing your brothers in Christ to sin. So it was very like pushed that you had to be modest or the boys would lust after you. So even as a youth group, when we would go swimming, we had to wear a one-piece swimsuit underneath black boys' gym shorts and a dark colored t-shirt that was a high t-shirt, not like a v-neck. So a high t-shirt. And you had to wear that while swimming. So we're wearing like 4 layers. I don't even know why the one piece mattered at that point, honestly, because you're wearing clothes over top of it. But they were very big on like you had to wear a one piece swimsuit and it had to be lined and all of this stuff. And then I remember that I was like running one time in the youth group and one of the youth leaders' wives came up to me and mentioned that I should maybe wear like a sports bra over top of my regular bra because I was so heavy chested that they felt like I was causing my brothers in Christ to focus on that, which was so embarrassing. So when I was about 13 and they were really coming at me hard for being too opinionated, they would keep quoting Proverbs 31 about a meek and quiet spirit and what a good Proverbs 31 woman looked like for her husband in the future. And they were very against me speaking out about anything. I ended up going to the public high school when I think I was about 15 when I went to the public high school, and I was supposed to go as like a ministry, and they were all praying for me. They had like list of the kids that were going to the public school for some classes so that they could pray for them not to be taken in by like the devil. And so I remember that they would come check up on you to make sure you weren't like sliding. And I became friends with some of the goth kids, and just they were so nice to me. And I had been bullied my whole life in this church with my family, like this group of kids that was supposed to be my community. I had been bullied so hard by them for so long that I met these goth kids. I was wearing Hamrick's clothes, and they were so loving and kind to me and so gentle and so accepting. And I would like talk about what I believed because that's what I'm supposed to do. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's great that you believe that. No worries. You believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe, and what I believe is fine, and what you believe is fine. And I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That's fair. Absolutely. And I remember one of the Wilds girls was attending this school to be a minister as well. Funny though, she was only friends with the really rich, preppy kids, which made a lot of sense. The very stereotypical white kids that were very well off. And she came up to me while I was eating lunch with some of these goth kids, and she berated me for being friends with them and said that I shouldn't be friends with them, that they would lead me down a bad path, and how I was supposed to not be friends. They should only be my ministry. And I was surprised that she even talked to me because she was very good at ignoring me in the church. So I was surprised that she even like really wanted to talk to me. But that was really interesting because no, they've been really nice to me. I feel really comfortable around them. And I was so different being in a public high school and being more accepted than I was in like this cult environment that I was in. So that kind of is when I started to be like, I don't think everything you're telling me is true. And I started reading the Bible for myself and realizing that some of the teachings that they were presenting were so opinion based. It wasn't fact at all. It was just opinions that they had. And I was starting this like deconstruction process. So I decided to leave the church and go to a different church because at this point, after I graduated high school, I was in the college and career class leading to the college education that I chose. My family was very poor and struggling because this is when the recession happened. So my dad was gone for a good part of that. And I remember like having to split a can of peaches with my family like one night because we didn't have any food, and the church never reached out. So that was interesting because I felt like church, that's what you did. They always talked about how you rallied around like the members of the church, and they never ever checked in on how we were doing, like for reals, not just like, why weren't you in church this Sunday? Which is what they would ask, like, why weren't you in church this Sunday? So I was working like full time from the time I was 14. I graduated high school when I was 16, and I had been accepted into this big school, but my family couldn't afford for me to go to school like that. And my parents weren't doing so well. And there was like a chance that I was going to end up taking custody of my brother and sister. And this is like me at 16 thinking this. So I decided to go to paramedic school at Blue Ridge. It was a 2-year class. I would have a stable income that if I had to take custody of my brother and sister, then I could, because I didn't want them to end up with any of my extended family. So I decided to go to this college. Everyone in the church went to Bob Jones. That was like the option, Bob Jones or Pensacola. Those were the two options in the church. So they would have all of the seniors come down and have a video montage of their lives. And then it would say like where you were going to school and like what your plans were. And so I had said that I was going to paramedic school at Blue Ridge. And multiple church members came up to me and criticized my choice. They said that maybe I shouldn't go to a public university because
Oh,
what if my faith started to waver and I needed a Bible background before I went into the world. And I remember looking at them and saying, I've had a Bible education since I could talk. If I'm not prepared to enter the world at this point, then what are we doing wrong? And they were very appalled by that. They were like, the higher education from Bob Jones will really prepare you to be in the ministry and in the mission field. And I said, I'm not going to Bob Jones because you had to sign that document that said you would follow all those rules and stuff. And I read the document and I said, I'm not going to obey a curfew of 10 o'clock. I have been on my own since I was like 15, and I'm not going to be forced to be back in my room and accounted for. I was very against signing that document because in one way it was like the cult teaching because it's don't sign something that you can't uphold and you're going to lie about. So I didn't want to lie, so I wouldn't sign the document, which meant I couldn't go to the college. So it all worked out in the end, but I went to Blue Ridge and all of my classmates were 40-year-old men with families. So that was a huge culture shock because they are cussing and they would stop themselves and be like, oh shit, I'm sorry. I shouldn't cuss in front of you. You're like a baby still. And I was like, I'm sorry. It's good. Don't worry about it. It's fine. But they were very like surprised I was there. And I remember like trying to witness them. Like I would pray for my meals and stuff. And they would ask me to pray for them and things like that. But I started to come out of the shell of, wow, there's good people in the world. And I was told that everyone is bad if they're not part of this church. So there's good people that aren't a part of this church. And I can't believe that God looks badly on them for being kind to other people. So I really was like kind of mind blowing because everyone was so mean in the church that these people are so nice. So that was really interesting. So I decided that I needed some more community because again, I was this like weird town kid. And at this point, all of the other town kids had left. Like they'd gone to other churches or to different colleges. So it was like the Wilds people and me. And there was this group of Wilds interns called CAs. And because of them, they would schedule all the college and career activities around the camp schedule, which was really inconvenient for somebody who was trying to work. So I wasn't able to attend a lot of these events. And I felt like I always made an effort to see them, but they never made an effort to come to town to do something with me. So I had found another church that had contemporary music and was more loose, and you had people from all different backgrounds. And I decided to go to that church. I didn't hide it. I said I was going to leave and I was going to go to this church. Willie Parton came to me, sat me down, and said that he felt like I shouldn't leave because I was the bridge between the town people and the Wilds people, which we'll get into my Wilds experience about why he felt that way. But he said I was the bridge. And I was like, I don't want to be the bridge. I want to be fed. I don't want to be the one that has to reach out all the time. I would like a mutual relationship, which I think is fair. And it's shifted from we need you and we want you here and you're so important to us to you're being selfish leaving the church. Mind you, I'm not leaving Christianity. I'm just going to a different church. And he was like, you're being selfish doing this because we need you here. And if you leave, this is going to put a big hole in the ministry. And I said, if I was the only thing holding this ministry together, then that was a problem. So I was like, no, I'm still going to go to this other church. Then he decided to tell the pastor and the pastor's wife. So Kelly Collier called me after not speaking to me for years because I was low on her ministry list. She called me and she was like, let's meet and talk. So I met her for coffee because, again, my parents are still in this church. So I'm trying to leave on like a good note. And she was telling me how I really hadn't thought about this and how God really wanted me to stay in this church and how I would be going against God's will to leave because I was making a decision based off how I felt, not based off how I should be serving and sacrificing for the church, which is So typical, so typical. So that was that. And then it switched from that to I was a reprobate. Basically, I was leaving the church and I was entering full sin, which was terrible.
This is just screaming cults. And that's what cults want. They want 100% dedication to their group. And like you said, you weren't leaving Christianity, you're just leaving the church. And they were going to make sure that was not going to happen. And they were doing all their manipulation tactics to keep you there. But thankfully, you got away. Oof.
Yeah, which is true. I ended up leaving that church and going to another church instead for a little bit, which was great. And then I started working like every day. So I wasn't going to church at all. I just didn't share that openly because heaven forbid I not go to church on Sunday. So that was what happened. And then that's when I shifted into I actually got married and then moved away. And I think that was like my escape tactic. I'm divorced now, so it was not a good relationship to be in, but it was a relationship with a guy who was very like against Christianity for his own reasons. So I felt like he was still a Christian and he was still a part of it, but he was like openly like rebelling against it. So I felt like this was a kindred spirit and I didn't know anybody like that. So I think that's why I was so like interested in being with him. And it turned out to be a terrible mistake that we don't need to get into, but that was my escape, was to like marry this man and leave. But even in doing that, I felt like the only way out was to get married, which is really sad because that's how they like
Mm.
basically pushed it, was that as a woman, your sole goal was to get married. It wasn't to be single, was something that was really looked down upon. And they actually had a whole message about how single women didn't deserve to be feel like that or whatever, but it had been so conditioned at
Yeah.
that point that it was really dangerous teaching. So I know like several people like escaped in relationships from their cult backgrounds, and that's where it ended up for me. And thankfully
Yeah.
I got out of that too later down
Mm.
the road as I continued to deconstruct and evolve.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so sorry that it ended up not being a good relationship. And it is sadly something that is so common because you grow up in this cult that is authoritarian, that is narcissistic. And what happens a lot of times, and this was talked about by cult expert Rachel Bernstein in the Surviving BJU podcast, was a lot of the times these relationships you get into are narcissistic, abusive relationships because that's what's familiar. It's not you're not consciously doing it. It's an unconscious thing. As humans, we seek what's familiar, and those narcissistic, abusive relationships, you're not aware of it, but it's familiar, and it's so sad how that cycle continues on. And it's interesting because cult experts, they call narcissistic abusive relationships, they call them one-on-one cults, actually. That's what they refer to them as, because that control over another person, and they're using the same tactics as a cult but on a smaller person to person scale. And yeah, I'm so sorry that you got involved with that, but I'm so glad that you were able to escape. Ooh, and living a better life now.
Exactly. And then another like byproduct of that is after that, my family actually started leaving the church as well. And then now my family's totally out of the church, which is great. And my mom actually just got voted out of the church like a couple weeks ago. So this was something that was really interesting, is that my father had a lot of mental health difficulties, and that's normal. Like people have that, and he had a very hard childhood. It's totally normal that he had those issues. And he confided in the pastor, Matt Collier, about these difficulties that he was facing and how he had this extreme paranoia and he felt like he wasn't safe in the church. And to be fair, he probably wasn't, because that's how they were. And he was like, I just need time to like work through these emotions and feelings and go to counseling. So he was doing counseling with Matt Collier, who's not a licensed counselor. He's just a Bible major from Bob Jones. Matt felt like he wasn't able to help him, or he wasn't moving fast enough through the process of basically pushing all your feelings down and saying that it's God knows and you can't feel sad or upset or scared or anything like that, because that's doubting who God is. That was a big thing that they really preached, was any of those negative feelings that you felt weren't okay to feel because you're doubting God's character. So that was something really big. And he ended up telling another person in the church all of this very personal stuff that my dad had shared with him, and wanted that guy to start counseling my dad. And it was somebody that my dad did not trust at all and had a very negative reputation in the community, actually, because of some things that he had done. And my dad was like, no, I'm really not okay with the fact that you did this. And I think I'm just going to take a step back from the church. And again, they came to our house. They tried to like push us back in. And my parents had given so much money to this church over the years and like things like that to support them and the ministries and
Yeah.
all of this stuff. And we're outsiders still, which is so sad. They were still outsiders in a lot of ways. And my dad especially didn't have any friends in the church except like maybe 2 people. So that's so sad. And he
Mm.
took a step away from the church, and they decided to vote him out of the church because he wasn't coming back to church fast enough. So they went to vote him out. Only 2 people in the entire church that my parents lived in for 30 years, the only 2 people stood up and said that what they were doing was wrong. 2 people. That's it. So they ended up voting my dad out of the church. And so because of that, my mom stopped going and my brother and sister stopped going because we're family above everything else. And I do want to make that really clear. Like my parents, they went to a bad church, but they did the best they could as parents. And my home life with them was very good. So I don't want to say that I have no bitterness or anger towards my family for being in that situation. There's things I regret, there's experiences I missed, but I know my parents love me and I have a good relationship with them, especially since everyone has left this church. We've just grown really tight together. But from the beginning, it was family first, always. So that is why my mom and brother and sister ended up leaving the church as well, was because they kicked my dad out. And then they ended up voting my mom out recently, and they sent her this long email about how she was not in attendance, so they were going to vote her out of the church. And she emailed them back and basically told them that they had forced her to choose her family or her faith, and her faith was still very strong, but she was choosing her family. So it was sad. It was really
Good.
sad for them, but
Yeah.
I'm glad. I'm really
Good
glad
for
that they're
her.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. My whole family is out of the cult now, which is great. That was my entire childhood. That was my growing up years. I never went to prom. I never did any of those like classic experiences that people have. And everything was Bible and push down your emotions and don't talk about that because now you're doubting God. And if you did come clean about something with somebody, they would push you into counseling that you weren't ready to do with people that weren't counselors. They were just people in the church. So there was never this referral to like actually get help. They were just like, it's not okay that you feel that way. And even if you came forward about abuse, especially, that was something that they really frowned upon and made out to be your fault in a lot of ways, especially as a woman. And then they would say that you needed to forgive that person. And that was a big teaching in the church, was to forgive your abusers and attackers. So sad.
Yes, I know that's a teaching Rand Hummel pushed. It has an infamous sermon, which I will probably end up adding one of these episodes. But yeah, thank you so much, for bringing me and everyone else listening on this journey through Bethany Baptist and Brevard. And I know you ended up working at the Wilds, which we're going to dig into that into the next episode. It might be more than one because I know it's a lot. It is a lot. But thank you so much, Tabitha, for coming on to sharing those experiences. And I look forward to the next interview.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.